my second day of this residency here, and it felt so good to see friends that I had not seen in, I could say, more than a decade, and others who have not seen for less, but still, and new faces. And so I'm so grateful for the invitation, for the opportunity. For me, it's always a chance to get to connect with folks who are doing very important and inspiring work and exchange ideas. So I really like the idea of the grand exchange, because I'm considering that as an opportunity to, in the second part of our time, to really exchange experiences around engaging with systems and systems change. So thank you, Rigo. Our conversations have been tremendously inspiring and helpful over the years, and they continue to be. And thank you, Juliana, and thank you, Ben, and Sophia also, and all of you. Anyway, this is kind of almost like I don't want to call it a second part of yesterday, because yesterday we did something a little bit more expansive. So we had a little bit more time, and we had a workshop that I would summarize as mapping the territory of some of the systems wisdom, and also trying to engage with some tools and frames around places that bring us nowhere in system change. Meaning these are what Donella Meadows would call system traps, places of stuck, places of addiction, places of pain. Whenever we talk about systems thinking and systems change, I just want to acknowledge that the reason why we go through all the effort of engaging systemically around change is that nothing else seems to work, or it's not enough. And therefore, that means that the entrenched mechanisms and the pain that goes with the entrenched mechanisms is deep. And so I normally try to start with an acknowledgement of that pain. And like I did yesterday, I also want to start with a little bit of an embodied experience. I'm just going to jump actually to the end of the presentation. I try to read something that Donella Meadows wrote that to me is very relevant. Because yesterday, one of the pieces that came up is this idea that as a system leader, and I would consider any of us working to try to shift systems towards equity, beauty, fairness, we have this important role of holding a certain level of presence to the pain of the moment. And so it's really that balancing between holding current reality, and however difficult that is, and kind of maintaining and cultivating that aspirational spirit and intention. And so to me, the words of Donella Meadows are very resonant when she talks about the pain that is involved in engaging with systems work. Typically, the emotional side, as we talked to some of you, of systems thinking is put to the side, because of course we talk about systems thinking, and so oftentimes we just leave body behind, emotions behind, and so we have a special role, I think, in embodying a different way of presencing the pain and the reality of the world, and also creating spaces that are conducive to receiving that information. I remember sometimes I would get traumatized, I guess, when I would come back to the Gandhi Institute because of the way that the current reality was discussed in terms of, you know, data and trends, and it's all true. And there's a bitter side of truth telling that is very potentially paralyzing. So anyway, what are those spaces, those ways to engage with current reality, however difficult it is? And Dana would say we could strengthen ourselves to endure the pain of the enormous gap between the world we know and the world we profoundly long for. I believe that it's only by admitting, permitting, and carrying that pain that we can gradually move our world away from its present suffering and unsustainability and toward our deepest values and our dearest visions. which to me, I have also this other quote that I love to bring in from Ta-Nehisi Coates. I would not have you descend into your own dream. I would have you be a conscious citizen of this terrible and beautiful world. So this terrible and beautiful and conscious. So a lot of the work that we do, now I have to go the way back, but a lot of the work that I do, that we do at the Economy for Systems Change is really about engaging with awareness-based systems change. So yes, informing the invisible, unspoken rules, forces that shape the workings of systems, and at the same time becoming aware of our own inner states and how that manifests as we engage in systems leadership, which is like how we show up in systems for systems. And that's why I think, and I love the definition that my friend Anna Burney in School of Systems Change brings to the field is systems change is both an outcome and a process. And so for me / us, those are inseparable. The outcome and the process are inseparable, which leads to the other idea that systems change is fractal. And I think I mentioned that yesterday, meaning that we can embody that change in whatever we do, even in the culture that we create, even momentarily as we are together. So Donella Meadows is an inspiring force in the work I do. Well, first of all, because she is one of our founders. I used to work for the Donella Meadows Institute, and that institute essentially was the institute that Dana founded in 1996, called Sustainability Institute. And then we changed our name later on in 2016, Academy for Systems Change, where we now consider multiple streams of influence and lineage in the work that we do. And so Dana has done, so she would love to be called Dana, and so that's why I call her familiarly Dana. I also had the Donella Meadows project, and we have the website donellameadows.org that has more than 1,000 of her writings. But I think one of the things that Dana has done really that's very helpful for us is distillation of decades of work and trying to understanding systems through modeling. She was essentially obsessed with this notion that, or this question that I think many of you are obsessed about as well, which is, why is it that we, the larger we, design systems that end up depleting people and ecosystems? And basically they're lose-lose propositions at all levels. And she initially found these dynamics of kind of unexamined collapse built in the economic system. And I know that this is something that is very relevant for folks in ecological economics in particular. And so these unexamined assumptions that are built in the economic models. And she went on way beyond Limits to Growth, which not only she was the main author of, but then she coordinated that following editions, which is something interesting that a team continues for decades to actually map and be accountable and responsible to this body of knowledge. And so to me, that question, of how is it possible that we collectively create systems that generate outcomes that are really painful and nobody wants? And so that's one of the main big contradictions that she was obsessed by. And some of the answers come from her distillations, and one such distillation is leverage points that we also touched briefly upon yesterday. This idea that there are places in a system where intervening or understanding it can make actually a big difference across the whole system. We're not going to go into the details because this is not really a lecture, but I just wanted to name that this resource is available in many forms, and we recently actually published some reflections that Dana herself engaged in around how to use this frame. There is a little bit of an expectation that systems, yes, they are nonlinear, unpredictable, emergent, but there's something controllable about them, because if you know the leverage points, you can intervene. There's something manipulative almost about the systems approach. Like, okay, well, if you go there, you actually find your leverage points and you insist, or you work on these leverage points, then something will shift, which is true. It's a strategic approach. But she actually reminds us that this hierarchy of intervention points is a reminder. Is like, in whatever we do that has an aspiration to bring shifts in the conditions that hold a problem in place, which is the definition of systems change, changing the conditions that maintain the status quo, the problem in place, is a reminder again to not forget the invisible access points, the invisible acupuncture points, which she would place at the top of the list, like the number one, transcending paradigms, or really eliciting and exploring mindsets and goals of systems. So we're not going to go into all of this, but just to mention that I am invariably informed by this frame. It's a reminder. Where am I working? At what level am I working? And so in the rest of the time that we have, I would like to do a little bit of sharing about how I have been engaging with systems. And I don't know if it happens to you as well, but for some reason, you might be working on specific systems. I heard food system or seed system. There's been a lot of different systems. And I wonder how you got to work on that particular system. Because for me, I ended up working on the energy system, which is not my favorite. I'm a forest ecologist, I love forests, but for some reason I'm stuck with working with energy. Go figure. And so, but it makes you wonder, what are those early marks or early signs of something that hits you at a deep level that somehow leaves a mark or a scar on you, to the point that you actually have no other choice than engaging at that level within that system. And so here we are, energy. So I was born in the outskirts of Milan, in a working class neighborhood. It was an old school building, actually, where we lived. We didn't have a bathroom, believe it or not, in the almost downtown Milan, close to the outskirts. And there were thin glasses in the windows, and at night we would breathe in all the fumes of this refinery, actually, which is in Italian we call it raw pero agi refinery. And so this was something that I discussed yesterday as well. It felt such an environmental injustice that a child would have to breathe the fumes of this oil refinery. Fast forward to 10 years ago, in 2015, I ended up giving a talk about a lot of Vermont-based innovations, actually, on new economy. That was my work at the time at the Donella Meadows Institute. I went to this fair space, this one, and I gave a talk, and it was the food expo, the Milan Food Expo, with visitors from all over the world, representation from all over the world around seed systems and food systems. Anyway, I gave a talk about what cool things were emerging in Vermont. And as I was there giving the talk, I realized that the grounds of that fair were actually the grounds of the oil refinery. Wow. And I was like, what the heck? I was 40 plus years later. And so then I went to research what happened. And what happened was that in 1992, actually the oil refinery was deemed unnecessary, hazardous, and it took surprisingly little time for a number of stakeholders, representing even the oil companies, actually, to decide that needed to be dismantled and maybe go through a process of gentrification of that area. Anyway, the outcome was that with dynamite, they took down the chimney stacks. And I just love the smirk of this engineer just turning towards the camera, a little bit of satisfaction. So for me, it's interesting how, okay, I was scarred by the energy system, the fossil fuel energy system in particular. And then there was some coming full circle right there. And I don't know if that has happened to you. Of course, and then I had to be drawn in and join a movement against the pipelines. I live in the Upper Valley of Vermont and New Hampshire. That's an area where actually the Upper Valley watershed of the Connecticut River considers itself by state. So there is not much of a separation in the states, which is great because then ideas can flow and organizing and service providing actually happens across. And so we had a case where one of the main utility companies wanted to invest in gas pipelines in our area where we deemed that it was not necessary. And it was harmful because, speaking of addiction to symptomatic solutions, this would have built infrastructure that would have been in use and that we would have been addicted to for decades to come. And so, of course, there was a lot of opposition. I was part of an initial so-called strategic group. So we were more like the thinkers, the systems thinkers. And at the time, we didn't have much of a following. But then in 2016, it was the first time that Trump got elected. And all of a sudden, we had 8 groups wanting to stop pipelines as a way to channel that energy, interest and force. And so in terms of a systems perspective, one of the large points is actually the self-organizing of systems, the ability to self-organize. And I always am amazed at how people can actually build movements with little knowledge. So we were. We thought we needed a strategic kind of head of the whole group. But then there were all sorts of pushback because we were seen as the ones who had the knowledge, maybe we were the experts. And so we actually had to readjust how we were seeing ourselves and learn on the ground while doing actually. And essentially it became so interesting that there was so much participation, but there was so much chaos. We didn't have a spokesperson or a group, a communication group. We were not organized in working groups because there was not enough trust. Everything spurred so quickly, and there was distrust around the experts in the room. And so what happened was kind of chaos. But at that point, there was a systems principle that I don't think Dana talks about necessarily, but we learn by doing, and it was, well, even if it's incoherent and going in all sorts of directions, as long as the goal is shared, we're okay with it. We are okay with the mess. We are okay to be denigrated for being, illiterate in matters of policy or how the public utility companies work, etc. So, and eventually, actually, we coalesced. There was an active facilitated process that really needed to build trust and connection. So yesterday we talked about the fact that more systemic solutions or interventions take more time to happen. And so giving ourselves, in that case, the time to coalesce, to build the trust. And the bottom line was that we were able to stop the pipelines. And so since, I would say, almost 10 years ago, we have not had the utility companies actually coming back with this proposal. It took many strategies. I'm not going to talk about the different tactics, but eventually I wanted to point to the fact of there are some cases where you want to talk about systems thinking explicitly. Some other times you just go with the flow and your intuitive sense or accept a lot of mess. And going this way, and a different style of working on energy, very different, has been this actually systemic solution that is Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire. So I live in New Hampshire. And in this case, it was all very different because so as part of my energy committee, we were in a network. We were in a learning network with each other. And I think we were all, or many of us, waiting for the perfect alignment of policies that would enable a number of municipalities to come together to buy electricity, but beyond just bulk power, but actually changing the whole structure of the energy system. By that, I mean that we've become now 70 plus municipalities in New Hampshire who are represented by a governing body that is a nonprofit that has the brokering power in the energy market. And it has representation from all of the different towns, and it has a value of democratizing energy access, electricity, and also saving people money, and so enabling more access indeed. And so this is something that required a lot of work, but not so much. Only in 2 years, we moved from not being organized this way at all, but with the right change of policies that we were just needed to be aligned. And one such policy change was that normally bulk purchases of electricity, you need to opt in if you want it. And so you never reach the so-called economy of scale. But in our case, the default was changed. So there's power in changing the default. You're actually locked in. So if a town decides to go for this, the whole community becomes, all the residents are included, brought in, and then your option is to opt out. And so that makes it so much easier. And this is spreading like fire. Last time that actually I was at a meeting, there were 60 communities, now there are 70 in several counties. And this is happening in a not particularly progressive state, so New Hampshire. And so another lesson has been that at the municipal or community level, this kind of partisanship and divisiveness is really not there, meaning that we can create processes and reward systems that actually are appealing to everybody in the community. And that for me has been the real work beyond kind of these ideological divides, because of course there is an invested interest in dividing us ideologically. And we can just demonstrate and talk even more about the fact that it's possible not to fall into that trap. How am I doing on time?
Great, keep going.
Okay, housing. I mentioned that when I grew up in Milan, my house was not the best. And that story of housing continued on. My family had several cases where we actually didn't have proper house, or we stayed with grandparents and family split. So housing has been actually another one of those scars that made me kind of stuck again with another system, which is housing. And I actually was delighted to work with a very interesting organization in Italy that is working on housing first. Do you know about housing first? It's actually a model of addressing housing insecurity that originated in the US, and it's this idea of rethinking about who the house insecure person is. And so you start breaking down those belief systems, based on meritocracy and all of that, and you start designing actually approaches that you don't have to jump through hoops to actually get services or get help. It's the idea the house comes first, and so it goes back to the idea that housing is a human right, and some countries have that part of their own constitution. And so, so the housing first is really that kind of system-oriented solution. So that places the person first. And in Italy, then therefore, around this whole idea, they have created a learning network of 169 organizations of all kinds, from the smallest church-based organization to education organizations, banks, hospitals. So it's really broad, and so I was invited to provide support on a systems approach. So obviously, this is a systemic approach, a systemic intervention. Does it mean that this reduces visible outcomes of housing insecurity? That's another story. It's another story because this organization does not have necessarily access to all of the levers that you need to put in motion to change your outcomes. But it is an important stepping stone because it's a systemic solution. And so in this photo, we were actually working on an iceberg model. And so the iceberg model is this idea, this metaphor that is used a lot by folks who like to talk about systems thinking. This idea that events are the only visible parts of what actually is behind any event. In this case, visible housing insecurity, say on streets. Burlington is a great example of that as well. But then if you go deeper, what's behind, what's below the surface? What are the dynamics as this being increasing? As what are the factors behind that? And belief systems, etc. So just to conclude quickly, this was a case where I brought systems thinking, obviously, I say explicitly. So it's not that I try to be a system leader and gauge when I use the word system or not. In this case, yeah, we're going to talk systems here. And actually to the point that I was touched. In 2023, we had what we called a consensus conference. All of these representatives came together to coalesce around 7 visionary challenges for the next 10 years. And when I went to the room that was filled with 250 plus people, and I was speaking about systems thinking over there, I saw the walls of this room that were plastered with iceberg models and with all these sticky notes from 50 different towns all over Italy. And these were circles that actually used the iceberg model to talk about what was happening in their communities. Why were they seeing these very hard to bear situations, and beyond the event level. And so these are almost like testimonies of these conversations. And so whenever I present a tool, for me it's very important that that tool is not only illuminating our way of thinking about systems, but it's also an opportunity to convene, an opportunity to have conversations, and conversations that are informed by systems thinking. And then, of course, you do something about this. What we do is this a stepping stone to talking about strategy? Maybe not. Maybe there is a gray area in between this conversation and the strategies. This is also something that came up yesterday. What if the solutions are actually not visibly there? What then? So here again, targeting, creating consensus. And lastly, I'm just going to talk about a completely different approach around housing, which is, as I said, as Rodrigo said, I'm a facilitator of Telling My Story, which is a program that brings community together across divides to be able to witness and experience one another's humanity first, and then connect across lived experiences. The goal, I of course engaged with a housing insecure community in the Upper Valley. It's a serious issue over there as well. And in rural areas, takes a completely different form, with people living in the woods and dying out in the cold. So we had actually 19 people last year who died in relationship to housing insecurity. And so our goal, this was from last year, was to convene a group that was diverse in terms of their experience with housing insecurity, from people who were literally living in the woods and policymakers who are on the select board of some of our towns. And with this idea that the storytelling, because ultimately we want to get to the story part, but the storytelling is not that the people with lived experiences tell the stories to the policymakers, and the policymakers get a aha moment and do something. It's not that. So again, going back to this idea of creating the containers for where you hold the hard reality, you build the relationships and the trust across these different groups. And so here, I was one of the facilitators for this 3 days workshop where we have 2 evenings of 3 hours where we do drumming together. We do some, in this case, we're balancing, building trust by balancing with our bodies, finding like a center of gravity that is shared. And so we do a lot of different activities. And ultimately, the last day is a full day where we actually help the community build a shared manifesto. What do we believe? What do we want other people to actually listen to or hear from us? And then we build a wall, a symbolic wall made of boxes and graffitis, and these are our data. We put our data on boxes and mixed with graffitis, and then we have a performance where any participant, including me when I participated, we read our testimonial, our story, and the stories are intense, and the audience is there to hold that intensity and then to engage at the end in a meaningful conversation. And I think here's the wall and some of our participants talking about how they see themselves and how the world sees themselves, and a lot of our that's when actually I learned that Vermont was this the second state in terms of homelessness per capita, and then there's a whole story about the data, but and so we learned collectively about that, and we put that data, piece of data, on our boxes. And that's going to be the end of my sharing. So I just want to touch on a few of the examples of how to engage with systems. But the one last thing I want to say about this is that for me, it's not only about bringing the community together across divides and stigmas. There's something about hearing multiple stories of struggle that start to paint a systemic picture. It's almost a mosaic of stories and voices, where the individual person who experiences housing insecurity might feel a sense of shame and failure. And then when you start actually reclaiming your voice and listening to other stories and being held and building trust also with decision makers, that changes something. That starts to become systemic. So that's what I got intrigued lately about the fact that you discover how systems are brittle and leave people behind, and how getting close to this pain actually illuminates what systems are designed for and who they are designed for and who they exclude. And I just want to leave you with that for now. Thank you.